We called this session, It All Starts with a Question. And I picked this quote from Albert Einstein because there's so many things that this wise and very, very, very smart scientist said that's really important when we think about young children. And this is one that I really like a lot. The important thing is never to stop questioning. Because really, as we learned about each other, what did we do? We asked questions. And of course, how do young children learn about the world around them? We ask questions. Has anyone ever traveled in another country, in another culture, how did you learn about it? You ask questions. One of the first things I learned to say when I was living overseas was, "What is that?" And I lived in China, so I said it a lot. 这是什么? So it's important to always ask questions, but we know that not all questions are created equal. Different questions result in different things. So not all questions are the same. Closed questions. Can anyone help me define what a closed question is?
Answer yes or no.
Right. If you can answer it yes or no. What does that do to a conversation when it stops it dead? Absolutely. And so yes or no questions really, and I like that these are green and red, but really it's just they stop the conversation, they end it. And sometimes even single word answers that don't require much thought on our part can also stop the conversation. And so as you were discussing in your groups, did you find that you were eliciting more or less information when you asked closed yes or no questions? Yeah. Less, yeah, a little bit less. So then obviously, there's another kind of question, and those are open-ended questions. And can someone help me define what is an open-ended question?
How are you feeling?
Yeah, this is a good example. How are you feeling? It's a question that requires more than just one word as an answer. Yeah.
Well, tell me about yourself.
There you go. Yeah, tell me about yourself. Something that invites you to spend some more time and to divulge more information. Yeah.
I think it's good they don't have a right or wrong answer.
Yes, exactly. Often, or simply, we just don't know what the answer could be. Right.
There's no right or wrong way to answer.
Right, and so it invites people to take a risk, maybe. There's a little bit more risk involved in an open-ended question, but the gains are much bigger, too. And so, of course, the kinds of things we would ask in an open-ended question are these kind of standard things, or journalism questions almost. Who, what, where, when, why, how, and questions and answers. And of course, good questions can take us off in all sorts of new directions. But again, not all open-ended questions are created equally either. So I want to talk a little bit about scientific questions. And I'm going to stop a moment and mention that today and tomorrow, we are all scientists. And part of what we're going to be doing is learning to think like a scientist, and that starts with asking good questions, good scientific questions. And science begins in preschool. It begins as a young child. And Mary Ellen and I are wearing lab coats that I borrowed from my father, who is an actual scientist. He's a retired biochemist. And he wanted me to be sure and tell you these were worn by a real scientist. I said, but aren't we all real scientists? But if you get close enough to Mary Ellen, they still smell a little bit like formaldehyde. Some good chemical smells, so that's nice too. But scientific questions, connecting questions. Connecting question is just a question that kind of leads you to make a connection. Yay. between two things. And that's part of what we did in our icebreaker activities. We were looking for connections between us as we look for those shared characteristics. What are the experiences we have in common? What are the qualities and characteristics that we have in common? Predicting questions. A really important part of scientific inquiry is predicting, is trying to guess and think about what will happen next. What will happen if I pull the block out of the middle of the tower? What will happen if I kick Mary Ellen in the... There will be an equal and opposite reaction. Evaluating questions. I'm going to look at my cheat sheet real quick. An evaluating question, there are things like, what do you like about this? What do you think about this? Asking them to kind of to process and evaluate what's going on. And what don't you like? Or how are these things the same? How aren't they the same? And to kind of think more deeply on that level. Attention focusing questions. I love using this kind of question with young children because they notice details. And you can ask them questions that help them focus on the details that you think are maybe more important, or get them to look more closely and see what they notice. I love that picture we used at the beginning of the meerkat and the cat, because there isn't really a right answer, because there's two right answers. They're different. One of those things was different than the others, but there were two different ways. And sometimes you can present a child with something, ask them an attention-focusing question, and get them to look in, and they will see something very different than what you see. Have you ever had that happen?
I have an example.
Yeah.
When I grew up in Billings, there was a grocery store named Noise. Somebody named Noise run the grocery store. My younger brother, looked at it and called it the No, Yes grocery store.
Ah, very good. Measuring and counting questions. If there's one thing that scientists love, it's data. And so asking questions that count and measure how long, how wide, how tall, how many, how much, all of those things, but that encourage you to kind of collect some data and think about quantifying what you're looking at. So there's some questions where you look at the quality, like the evaluating questions, but the quality of something, but then there's the quantity, and you try to kind of measure and see, what is that all about? Comparison. And again, just like we did, one of these things is different from the others. How are we alike? How are we the same? Mary Ellen and I do that a lot because as we've worked together over the years, we have grown more and more like one another, and much to the consternation of our colleagues. So, comparison. Hi, welcome. And then action questions. And action questions really are questions that encourage exploration and investigation of properties and events. So, and children love to do stuff, you know, and so asking a question, well, what will happen if I pull this block out? Well, why don't you go ahead and do that? What will happen if I add the vinegar to the baking soda? Have you done that experiment ever? What happens when I add the baking soda and vinegar together? It fizzes, it bubbles up. It makes a mess if you use a lot of it. And then problem-solving questions. Problem-solving questions really help children kind of scaffold. If you see a child struggling, trying to do something or make something work, sometimes asking the right kinds of questions can help give them the scaffolding to figure it out on their own. My husband is very fond, we've always referred to our children as little monkeys, affectionately, but he likes to say monkeys need monkey bars. They need something to climb on. They need something to build on. They need that scaffolding. And when you're learning to think, and it doesn't come naturally, some of us know adults for whom it still doesn't come naturally, but learning to think, children really need that kind of scaffolding. And we can provide that by asking problem-solving questions. You know, I don't think that's working the way you want it to. What have you tried? And have them talk to you about, well, what have they tried that doesn't work? Well, what do you think, what do you want to try next? And encourage them to think about that process. This still works, even with my middle schooler. I was helping her with her math homework last night, and the first thing I said was, what have you tried? And she said, well, nothing. And I said, okay, well, it looks like, you know, this problem needs a table. Have you drawn a table? Why don't you, what will happen if you draw the table? And then what are the knowns? And what are the unknowns? And suddenly she was on a roll and starting to figure it out, but I needed to ask her the questions to help her start processing and problem solving. And the last one are reasoning questions that encourage reflection, because it's not enough just to problem solve and kind of move on. You want to take that moment to pause and reflect and think about, well, what did I try? And what worked and what didn't work? And why do I think that is? And then constructing new ideas. So the next time I encounter this problem, what could I do differently than I did this time? And how will I go from here? And also, it's really fun to ask kiddos, can you explain that? Can you explain why you think that? Or can you explain why that happened? They have wonderful explanations. Sometimes they're odd, but they're not wrong. And when you figure out the way they're thinking, everything a child says makes sense to them in their own worldview. Have you experienced this? And you go, well, okay, but sometimes they're missing some key facts. Sometimes they're missing some key realities, and we can help them fill in those gaps. But everything a child says about the way the world works makes sense to them based on the information they have. And so it's our privilege as the adults who know better to ask them questions and encourage them to be reasoning and processing through and kind of reflecting on reality and thinking about, well, why do I think that? And if I have a new piece of information, how do I then incorporate that into what I know about the world around me? So we're going to play a little, have another activity, and Mary Ellen's going to talk you through that.
So we have a fun activity here, and it really is fun. I'm not just saying that. What it is we're going to show you how to combine a story with some math and science concepts. And this one, you're going to get into groups again. You're going to actually take out something out of your bags. We are going to use the blocks, the little square package of Melissa and Doug blocks. So Gwendolyn has those there. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to read a story right now to you. And I want one person in your group to be acting out the story with the blocks. So you're going to be using the blocks to kind of tell the story, go along with what I'm doing. And then the other people at the table, you're going to need a piece of paper and a pen. And you're going to be writing down all the math words and science words that you hear, any concepts that you recognize as we read the story.
And you probably only need one set of blocks for this.
Yes, yeah.